Hey everybody, I wanted to show you how you could put together a project in After Effects that shows off a concept called parallax. So, first of all, I've got this zip file that Jake gave me, and I put it inside the project folder. Inside my project folder, I create an assets folder. Within that, I make a folder for files from the client, and after moving the zip file to that location, I extract its contents. The first Photoshop file is a boat. I check the Layers panel to make sure I haven't missed anything. Next, I open up the second Photoshop file. I press Tab to hide the interface, Ctrl R to hide the rulers, and F a few times to get to full screen mode. F7 shows me the Layers panel. I take time to inspect the layers. Notice the original picture is included in the file, just in case we need it. I isolate the individual layers and copy-paste them into new documents. I save each out as its own PNG file. Alright, so let's jump over to After Effects. In After Effects, I double-click the project panel to import the assets. Adding folders for my assets helps me stay organized. I create a new composition at 1280 by 720, 30 frames per second for 20 seconds. I drag the assets into the composition, but they are not properly aligned, so I decide to import the original Photoshop file for reference. This scene is too large for my composition, so to shrink everything down, I create a null object that I can parent all of my other objects to. I can then scale the null object to resize my entire scene. One by one, I move the layers to match the Photoshop guide. Notice that my layer order is backwards and requires rearranging. Now I bring the boat to the top layer. I press P to show the position property, and I right-click to split the X and Y dimensions. Pressing the stopwatch enables keyframing for the X position property. I scrub the playhead forward and adjust the boat's position. The moving boat is nice, but I also want a moving camera. I could keyframe the position property of the scene controlling null object. All of the buildings and the boat will move together. But since none of the buildings move relative to one another, the illusion of depth is broken. Luckily, creating parallax in After Effects is easy. It requires a movable camera and 3D layers at varying depths. I start by right-clicking in my composition and making a new camera. Now I can use any of the camera movement tools in the main toolbar. Initially, they don't appear to do anything because none of my layers are 3D. So I select and unlock all of my layers, and I turn them into 3D layers by clicking on the far right switch. Now I can orbit my camera around them. The camera has unique properties like zoom, which controls the lens angle. I can create wide angle, telephoto, and everything in between. When I'm done orbiting, I click Reset to move the camera back to its initial location. So all of these layers that I made 3D, they now have Z position properties. I adjust the Z position of each of the layers to bring some closer to the camera. After moving the layers forward, I have to translate and scale them to realign with the Photoshop guide layer in the background. Now that the set is built, I frame my camera's opening and ending shots by setting keyframes for the camera's position and point of interest properties. I actually spent a lot of time tweaking the camera movement. As I do, I have to adjust my set to make sure the camera can't see the edges of the images. Next, I move the boat to the foreground and continue adjusting my camera's final position. As I play back the animation, I notice that the camera jerks to a stop as it arrives at its final destination. To fix this, I can set those keyframes to use easing. I want to adjust the keyframe so that the camera slows to a stop even more gradually. Unfortunately, these properties are multi-dimensional, and as such, I don't have any Bezier handles to manipulate. Instead, I can switch to manipulating this property's speed graph. The speed graph is a graph of the slope of the value graph. By adjusting it, I can fine-tune any property's easing. Well, now I decided I want to change the position of the boat. Since I've moved it to the left side of the screen, I now want it facing to the right. To make the boat move to the right, I'm going to select and time reverse the position keyframes. To mirror the boat layer, I set its scale X property to -100. Here, I decide to make the animation longer by moving the final keyframes to the right. It's time to add some depth of field. The camera does have depth of field settings, but I'm going to fake depth of field by adding blur effects to each layer. I keyframe the blurriness value to increase as the camera approaches its final position. The further away a layer is from the camera, the higher value I use for blurriness. I then select these values, switch to the value graph, and I add easing to the keyframes. In the next part of this video, I add a floor to my set. I'm going to create a floor made out of water. So first I make a new composition out of the foremost layer. I use the rectangle tool to add a mask to the layer. I then decide to scale up the water to fill the composition. I should note that I guess I really didn't need the mask after all. Here I decide to organize my assets a bit by creating a folder specifically for pre-comps. I rename this pre-comp to water. I add the water comp into my main composition and I make it a 3D layer. I want to see my scene from above, so I switch to a 2-view layout. I change my left view to show a top-down orthographic projection of the scene. From here, I grab my water layer and I move it in front of my building layers. I scale down the water and rotate it around its x-axis. I then spend some time scaling and positioning the water to hide any edges. Eventually, I decide to set the X rotation to exactly -90 degrees. At this new angle, I again adjust the water's position. From a side view, we can see the water layer as a horizontal line. That little vertical line is the boat. I move the boat up so that it sits on the water's surface. My next goal is to give the boat some movement. I don't want to see the other layers, so I select all other layers and click on the Shy switch. I can then toggle Shy for the entire composition. Before I begin working, I want to change to an orthographic view. Instead of doing this the easy way, I decided to turn off my camera layer and set my view to use the active camera. I probably should have just set my view to front. I decide that the boat needs to bob in the water, so I move its anchor point and keyframe its Z rotation value. I spend a while oscillating that value back and forth, constantly tweaking the values and the timing between them. Eventually, I arrive at something like a sine wave, so I decide to simply code the animation instead. I disable keyframe animation for this layer, and I Alt-click on the stopwatch. In the expression editor, I type in math.sine, and then in parentheses I type time. We can view the result of our expression in the graph editor by clicking the little graph button next to the expression. As the animation plays, the time variable increases. This produces a simple sine wave. However, the period of the sine wave should be shorter. For this, I can accelerate time by multiplying it by 10. After previewing, I decide to multiply time by 5 instead. The amplitude of the wave is too great, so I multiply it by 0.5. I want the boat's position to bob up and down as well. Instead of creating another sine wave, I decide to add the boat's rotation to its position each frame. I Alt-click on the stopwatch for Y position, and I adjust the code to add rotation to the Y position. Notice how the pick whip helps. It looks like the boat's bow is too low in the water. I temporarily disable the expression, adjust the Z rotation value, and re-enable the expression. I then modify my expression to add the keyframed value to the expression. Now I want to make the water look animated. First, I isolate the water layer. I have a liquefy effect on the water now, but I realize that this is the wrong effect, so instead I decide to apply a wave warp to the layer. I play with the effect values until I'm happy with the results. To add additional undulations to the water, I add a turbulent displace effect. To make it easier to see while I'm working, I also add a levels effect for more contrast. The final result looks great. At this point, you should continue working on this project and make something uniquely your own. I continued working on my video, and here is the result. With my video, I was trying to create an intro for an 80s or 90s television show. One of my inspirations was the intro to Family Matters. Before working on this project, I did some research online. I found references and I paid special attention to the shots, typography, and music style. Many of the changes I made to this video fall into a category of considerations called world building. It's one thing to have some buildings with parallax, but to make a scene feel realistic, we have to build a detailed world around it. I want to give you an overview of how I use the tools in After Effects to help flesh out my world. First of all, I modified the camera to swoop into the scene. This movement feels interesting, and the final shot looking up at the buildings is a common establishing shot in television shows. As the camera swoops, I also animated the lens angle a little in an attempt to make the camera look like it's moving faster. To accommodate the camera movement, I had to make the set larger. I added additional building layers and I duplicated the water. I left a smaller water layer in for more detail as the camera swoops down near the water. The set rig now moves and rotates with the camera for a smoother sweeping animation and to make the buildings look bigger by swooping the camera down very low for that final shot. I probably could have also experimented with increasing the lens angle of the camera. I've added particle systems to simulate fog, pollution, and clouds. I should probably focus on making the particle systems more subtle. I've given the boat a reflection in the water by duplicating the boat layer. The new layer is rotated 90 degrees, it has a blur effect on it, and it is parented to the boat, so it moves wherever the boat moves. To add more detail, I added another boat in the background. If I had more time, I would make the flags flap in the wind, I'd make birds fly by, and I'd add buoys in the water. Well, I took this entire composition and I nested it inside a new composition. Here I've desaturated the colors, added contrast, and created a lens flare. To create a vignette effect, I've added a partially transparent black layer with a feathered mask. For a lens distortion effect, I added an adjustment layer that blurs the edges of the screen. A yellow layer with a multiply blending mode gives the scene a sepia feel. Finally, I used an adjustment layer over everything else to add film grain. In the next video, I'll show you how to add audio to your project, so stay tuned.